So it's important to develop the ability to be able to play your drums at all different volumes. The drums are essentially an acoustic instrument, and we control how soft or how loud they get. We don't have a volume knob. Like an electric guitar player might have a volume knob, and they can just turn up or turn down. But us as drummers, we have to do this physically. Now, I find there's a lot of drummers out there, even really great drummers, that are very comfortable at playing at a certain volume, but when asked to play at other volumes, they don't sound that great because they're not comfortable there. So, I mean, typically it's drummers that like to play loud all the time, and when you ask them to play very quietly, they just sound like crap because they're not comfortable there. They haven't spent time practicing at very soft volumes. And I generally find that it's a lot harder to play well at super soft volumes than it is to play at loud volumes. So periods of my life, and I know other drummers that have done this, is we've just spent a lot of time in the practice room playing very, very soft in order to develop a comfort zone for that dynamic. So it's important to work in all kinds of different dynamic ranges. I mean, also playing very, very loud can be hard, and it's there's more physical, there's more physicality involved, so that can be a challenge as well. But what determines the volume that you're playing at? There's some different factors. So maybe an obvious one is the style of music that you're playing. Okay, so for example, jazz is usually played pretty soft in comparison to rock, which is played pretty loud a lot of times. But, even within jazz, this may not always be the case. If we're playing in a big band with a huge horn section and stuff like that, then there's certainly a lot of moments where, as a drummer, we're going to hit pretty hard in order to cut through the mix and drive the band. But your typical acoustic piano, upright bass, jazz trio, or whatever, that's usually a very soft dynamic range. And a lot of times we use brushes in that situation because sticks are just too hard to control at that super soft volume. Now, rock a lot of times is loud. You got electric guitars, you got a PA, things are mic'd up, and that music just wants to be loud. It kind of doesn't work right when you have to play it soft. And there will be times where you're asked to play rock music soft, and it kind of doesn't translate. So, style of music determines your volume. But not always. There's other things. Like, who are you playing with? What's the band you're playing with? Sometimes people have certain volumes they just like to play at. And, they're not comfortable in other ranges. So you will have to, you'll have to deal with that. A typical example of that might be, let's say you're playing with a guitar player, like a blues guitar player. Now, blues guitar players, a lot of times they're coming from like the old school tradition of using a tube amp, and tube amps sound the best when they're cranked up pretty loud. They get a little crunch to them, but when they're turned down quietly, they just don't sound that great. So a lot of times, older school blues guitar players are going to play pretty damn loud, and because they like the way their amp sounds, and you're just going to have to play at that volume, So it kind of depends on who you're playing with. Another big factor is the venue or the room, like acoustically, where are you playing? A lot of times, smaller spaces, smaller rooms, we generally want to play softer. Bigger spaces, we can play louder, and a lot of times we do want to play louder. And, this is just like the nature of acoustics. If you play very loud in a small space, anyone that's in that small space, the audience, for example, you're just gonna blast them out. Whereas a big space, there's so much room that the sound waves have places to go, and it doesn't seem as loud, even though you might be playing very loud. Now, again, this may be not always the case. Couple examples, like if you're playing in a school gym, a gymnasium, big space, basketball court, hard surfaces, the sound is very, very boomy and bounces around forever. Technically, you can play very loud in that space, but I usually try to play softer in those spaces because you can actually hear what's going on. As soon as you start playing louder, the sound is amplified and it just bounces around forever, and it's really hard to hear as a musician what's actually going on stage. Everything gets very muddy and murky and it's hard to hear. So that's a situation where it's kind of better to play soft or medium volume if you can. The opposite of that, when I was in New York, I used to go to the 55 bar and see Wayne Krantz Trio with Keith Carlock on drums. At very small room, the logical thing to do would be to go in there and play softer, medium volume, so it's not too loud for the audience and everyone that's there. But those guys, man, they just rocked out. It's like they're playing in an arena or something. They just didn't care, and it was loud. But it's a different approach, and they obviously they're super amazing musicians, and that was a decision that they made. They didn't just play that way out of ignorance. So it's not always what you would think, but and depending on the band, like I said, some musicians play at a certain volume, and they don't change that depending on the room they're in. I typically like to adjust to the room. I think it makes sense, but doesn't always happen. So, other factors. This may not be quite as obvious, but the stage mix determines the volume that you play at, whether you want it to or not. So by stage mix, if you're not familiar with that, basically, what are you hearing on stage when you're sitting behind the drums playing music? The mix that's actually going into your ears. So ideally, you're hearing all the instruments at the perfect amount that you want to be hearing, and every situation is the same. And that's just never the case. So, it's important to understand what you're hearing when you're playing and understand how that's affecting the volume that you're playing at. So, a couple examples would be, let's say the bass amp is, it's facing you and it's closer to you more than you would like it to be. So you're getting a lot of bass guitar coming into your ears. Now that's going to make you play a lot louder than maybe you want to, because the bass is very powerful. It eats up a lot of space, and you feel like you need to hit harder in order to be in balance with the bass. But what might actually be happening is that out front where the audience is, it sounds like the drums are way too loud, because they're not getting that amount of bass out front, and they're getting all the drums, so it's out of balance. The opposite example would be you're playing too soft. So classic thing might be you're doing a gig and there's an acoustic piano and it's set up on the other side of the stage, and and that's just the way it is, and you got to deal with it. And so you can't hear it all that well because of the distance between you and the piano. And then as soon as you start actually playing the drums, now you're really covering up the little bit of piano that you could hear. And so in order to be able to hear the piano and lock in with it, you have to play very, very soft. And that could be an issue. So out front to the audience, it sounds like they're just hearing a lot of piano and the drums aren't loud enough. So a couple examples of their stage mix. It does affect the volume you're playing at. Okay, so other factors, who's in charge of the situation? So, you know, if it's the band leader, sometimes, you know, whoever's in charge of the band, like I said, they may just have certain volumes they like to rock at, and you're stuck with whatever they like. And because it's not your band, you can't really say anything, and you just got to go with it. Another classic example would be the venue you're playing at. Let's say, you know, the venue hires the band you're playing in, and they're paying you, so technically they have the power to tell you what to do. And, you know, a lot of times they're telling you to turn down because, you know, let's say it's a restaurant and they, you know, the customers are complaining and it's too loud. They can't get in their food orders because the music's too loud, and they're just going to be telling you to turn down all night because it's affecting their business, which is understandable. But, you know, you may end up playing a lot softer than you want to in those situations. So, the venue, right? Big factor. Now, another thing to mention is, you know, the drums have a massive dynamic range. It's probably a bigger range than any other instrument, pretty much. It has the ability to play super quiet, whisper soft, and like super crazy ear-piercing loud. Now, a lot of times, we are reduced in that range, depending on all the factors I just talked about. So most of the time, we're not able to cover that dynamic range on a single gig or a single musical setting. You know, we might be playing soft to medium soft, but you can't go any louder than that. Or you might be playing loud and really loud, but if you play any softer, it's going to be wimpy, or, you know, the drums aren't going to cut through the mix. So a lot of times, even though we have this awesome, super fun dynamic range, we are reduced to a little segment of that. So something to be aware of. So anyways, I will stop rambling now. I hope this helped you a little bit. And the big takeaway, I think, is just make sure you're comfortable playing at all dynamic, all volumes. All dynamics, and playing soft is usually the hardest. So if you're typically practicing medium to loud all the time, make sure you spend some time practicing soft, because there's going to be times where you're asked to do that, and if you're not used to it, you're going to sound like crap. So that's the biggest thing. All right, cool. Thanks for watching. I will see you soon.